It wasn't the clatter of silverware or the murmur of expensive conversations that defined the night at Aria Ristorante. It was a whisper, a venomous little secret, spoken in a language a New York CEO assumed was his exclusive property. He saw a simple waitress, tired and insignificant, a prop in the grand play of his success. He used his words like a weapon, meant to belittle and amuse his date, confident they were a shield of impenetrable privilege. But he made one catastrophic mistake. He didn't realize his prop, the woman he dismissed as a nobody, understood every single syllable. And her reply wouldn't just correct his grammar, it would dismantle his entire world. Elara Vance believed you could measure a life in polished spoons. Each one she held under the dim, artfully arranged lighting of Aria Ristorante was a small testament to a dream deferred. The silver, cool and heavy in her hands, felt a world away from the worn, paper-thin pages of the linguistics textbooks that now gathered dust in a storage unit in Queens. Her fingers, calloused and aching, moved with an automatic, fluid grace, wiping away the faint smudges of a life she was supposed to be living. Tonight was a Tuesday. In New York City, that meant the restaurant was filled with the serious money, the ones who conducted business over $300 bottles of Barolo and plates of truffle risotto. The tourists and weekend warriors were gone, replaced by the sharks and the peacocks of the financial district. Elara preferred it this way. They were demanding, yes, but predictable. Their entitlement was a constant, like the low hum of the air conditioning. It was a noise you learned to tune out to survive. Her smile was her armor. It was a perfect, professional curve of her lips that never quite reached her eyes. Her eyes, a deep, thoughtful hazel, held a different story. A story of late-night bus rides back to a cramped apartment, of poring over her mother's mounting medical bills at a rickety kitchen table, and of the gnawing, persistent ghost of a life in Paris. A life of academic acclaim at the Sorbonne, of debating Foucault and Derrida in bustling cafes. A life where her mind, not her hands, was her most valuable asset. That life had ended the day her father's heart gave out, a casualty of a brutal corporate war that had stripped him of his company, his pride, and finally, his will to live. Vance Inovatek, his life's work, had been swallowed whole, and the shock waves had shattered their family. Her mother's subsequent illness, a rare autoimmune disorder exacerbated by stress and grief, had become a financial black hole. So Elara, the brilliant doctoral candidate, had traded her dissertation on Proto-Indo-European languages for a black apron and a corkscrew. Elara, Table 7 needs their check, and the Thorpes on 9 are asking for you, Michael, the restaurant manager, said in a hurried whisper as he passed her. Michael was a decent man, caught in the eternal purgatory between placating wealthy patrons and protecting his staff from their worst impulses. On it, she replied, her voice a soft, even melody that betrayed none of the exhaustion pulling at her bones. She approached Table 9, a wealthy older couple who were regulars. Mrs. Thorpe beamed at her. Elara, dear, that was a wonderful recommendation. The branzino was divine. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, Eleanor, Elara said, her smile warming with genuine affection for one of the few customers who used her name and looked her in the eye. As she cleared their plates, she overheard a snippet of conversation from a nearby table. A man with a booming, self-important voice was holding court. And I told him, if you can't close a 7-figure deal by lunch, you're in the wrong business. Elara didn't look over. She didn't need to. She already knew the type. It was the unofficial uniform of Aria, an expensive suit that fit just a little too tightly, a watch designed to be noticed from across the room, and an ego that required its own zip code. She finished with the Thorpes, reset the table with practiced efficiency, and moved back toward the kitchen, the weight of 1,000 polished spoons settling back onto her shoulders. She was just another face in the background, a silent cog in the machinery of someone else's extravagant night, and that was exactly how she needed it to be. Until, of course, it wasn't. The front door of Aria opened, and a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn evening air swept through the dining room. It was a shift in atmosphere, a subtle dip in the ambient warmth, as if a predator had just entered the ecosystem. His name was Julian Thorne. He didn't walk into the room, he conquered it. At 40-something, he was a portrait of predatory success, with sharp, tailored lines, silver-streaked hair swept back from a severe widow's peak, and cold blue eyes that scanned the room not with curiosity, but with assessment. They were the eyes of a man who didn't see people, but assets and liabilities. The CEO of Thorne Global Acquisitions, a notoriously ruthless private equity firm, Julian was a titan of industry, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and awe on Wall Street. On his arm was a young woman named Chloe. She was beautiful in the way a brand-new luxury car is beautiful, flawless, gleaming, and desperately trying to prove her value. Her dress was expensive, her laughter a little too loud, her eyes fixed on Julian with an adoration that bordered on anxiety. She was his latest acquisition, and like all his others, she was there to reflect his own success back at him. The host, a young man named Ben, approached them with a practiced smile. "Good evening, sir, madam. Do you have a reservation?" Julian didn't even look at him. His gaze was already sweeping the room, dismissing it. "Thorne, table for 2. By the window." It wasn't a request, it was a decree. Ben's smile flickered. "Of course, Mr. Thorne, right this way." He led them to one of the most coveted tables in the restaurant, a corner booth with a panoramic view of the city lights. Elara watched the procession from across the room. She felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. It was the instinct of a seasoned professional, the sixth sense that told her this table would be trouble. These were not people who had come to enjoy a meal. They had come to be seen, to perform, to wield their power like a blunt instrument. Elara's section. Of course. Michael caught her eye and gave her a subtle, apologetic nod. She took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and grabbed 2 menus, her professional mask sliding firmly into place. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm and pleasant as she approached the table. "My name is Elara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you with some water, perhaps a cocktail or a look at our wine list?" Julian was still scanning the room, as if searching for a more important person to talk to. He waved a dismissive hand. "Sparkling water, Italian, and bring the wine list." He finally turned his cold eyes on her, but not at her face. His gaze flickered over her apron, her simple black slacks, her sensible shoes. It was a look that lasted no more than a second, but it communicated everything. "You are nothing." Chloe, however, offered a brittle smile. "I'll have a Bellini, please." "Of course," Elara said, making a note. She returned moments later with the water and the heavy, leather-bound wine list. She presented it to Julian. He took it without a word of thanks, flipping through the pages with an air of profound boredom. "The sommelier would be happy to make a recommendation if you like," Elara offered politely. Julian looked up, a smirk playing on his lips. He leaned towards Chloe, speaking in a stage whisper loud enough for Elara to hear clearly. "They always say that. They're trained to push whatever's overpriced and needs to be moved." Chloe giggled, a nervous, high-pitched sound. Ilara's expression didn't change. She stood patiently, her hands clasped behind her back, a perfect statue of professional servitude. Inside, a familiar, weary anger began to smoulder. She had written a 40-page paper on the oenological history of the Burgundy region. She could probably tell him more about the wine he was about to order than the man who bottled it. But here, in this uniform, she was just an uneducated mouthpiece for the house. "We'll take the Chateau Margaux, 2005, Julian announced, closing the list with a thump. He hadn't even looked at the price, a clear power move. "And make sure it's decanted properly. I can't abide a wine that hasn't been allowed to breathe." "An excellent choice, sir," Ilara said, her voice flawlessly even. "I'll bring that right out for you." As she walked away, she heard him laugh. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound. "See what I mean?" he said to Chloe. "They just follow a script, no real knowledge, just a smile and a tray." Ilara kept walking, her back straight. The script was her shield, but she was beginning to wonder how much longer it would hold. The meal progressed like a slow-motion car crash. Every interaction was a fresh exercise in condescension. When Ilara presented the Chateau Margaux, Julian swirled it in his glass, held it to his nose with the dramatic flair of a seasoned actor, and declared it passable, a backhanded compliment designed to assert his superior palate. When their appetizers arrived, he complained that his seared foie gras was a degree too cool. Ilara apologized profusely, and had the kitchen fire a new one immediately, accepting his dismissive wave without a flicker of emotion. She was a ghost at their table, an invisible pair of hands refilling water glasses, clearing plates, and absorbing his casual disdain. Chloe, for her part, seemed to grow more animated with each of Julian's power plays, feeding off his arrogance as if it were an aphrodisiac. She touched his arm frequently and laughed at his pronouncements, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of being tethered to someone so unapologetically powerful. The breaking point came with the main course. Ilara placed Chloe's lobster thermidor and Julian's Wagyu steak before them. "Enjoy your meal," she said, with her practiced, placid smile. As she turned to leave, Julian called after her, his voice sharp. "Waitress." Ilara paused and turned back. "Yes, sir?" He pointed at his steak with a fork. "I asked for this medium rare. This is medium, at best. An amateur could see that." Ilara looked at the steak. It was perfectly cooked, a warm red center with a flawless sear. Any chef would have been proud of it. Julian Thorne was not interested in the quality of his food. He was interested in manufacturing a conflict. "I do apologize, sir," she said, her voice still a model of professional calm. "I would be happy to take it back to the kitchen for you." A flicker of annoyance crossed Julian's face. He had been expecting an argument, a defense, something he could crush. Her placid compliance seemed to infuriate him more. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to prove his dominance not just to Chloe, but to the world embodied by this quiet, unassuming waitress. He leaned back, a cruel, knowing smile spreading across his face. He looked at Chloe, and then, in a smooth, confident French, he switched languages, believing he was drawing a private, impenetrable circle around the two of them. "Regarde là, ma chérie," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look at her, my dear. Cette pauvre petite chose. On dirait qu'elle porte tout le poids du monde sur ses épaules. This poor little thing. She looks like she's carrying the entire weight of the world on her shoulders." Chloe, whose high school French was likely limited to bonjour and merci, simply tittered, basking in the exotic sound of the words and the intimacy of the moment. Ilara stood perfectly still. Her heart didn't race. It seemed to slow down, each beat a heavy, cold drum against her ribs. The French language, The language she had loved, studied, and lived in was being twisted into a crude weapon against her. Julian, emboldened, continued, his gaze still on Elara, though he spoke to Chloe. He was enjoying the performance, the sheer audacity of insulting someone to their face. Je parie que son esprit est aussi vide que son portefeuille, he sneered. I bet her mind is as empty as her wallet. C'est le destin de ces gens, nés pour servir, pour nous apporter nos steaks, et puis disparaître. It's the fate of these people, born to serve, to bring us our steaks, and then disappear. He gestured towards her with his fork, a final, dismissive flick. Elle ne comprend rien. Pour elle, ce n'est que du bruit, comme le bourdonnement d'un réfrigérateur. She doesn't understand a thing. To her, it's just noise, like the humming of a refrigerator. He finally finished, leaning back with a look of supreme satisfaction, waiting for Elara to offer another vapid apology about the steak and scurry away, blissfully ignorant of the daggers he had just thrown. The air grew thick and heavy. The low chatter from other tables seemed to fade into a distant hum. Elara didn't move. She didn't scurry. She didn't even blink. She simply stood there, absorbing every syllable, every carefully chosen insult. The professional mask she wore so diligently didn't crack, but behind it, something shifted. The weary, exhausted waitress receded, and in her place, the Sorbonne scholar, the linguist, the daughter of a proud man who had been destroyed by men exactly like this one, rose to the surface. The refrigerator was about to hum back. For a long moment, the only sound at the table was the faint clinking of ice in Chloe's Bellini glass. Julian Thorne's smug smile was frozen on his face, an arrogant monument to his own perceived cleverness. He was waiting for the inevitable, for the waitress to bow her head and retreat, cementing his victory. Elara took a slow, deliberate breath. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture of thoughtful consideration, and for the first time that evening, she truly looked at him. Her hazel eyes, no longer shielded by professional vacancy, were sharp and luminously intelligent. The change was so sudden and so absolute that Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was quiet, measured, and flowed with a perfect Parisian-accented French that made Julian's own confident speech sound clumsy and brutish by comparison. "Pardonnez-moi, Monsieur Thorne," she began, her tone exquisitely polite. "Forgive me, Mr. Thorne." The effect was instantaneous. Julian's eyes widened, the blood draining from his face. Chloe's manicured hand, which had been lifting her glass, stopped halfway to her lips. She stared, open-mouthed, first at Elara, then at Julian, her expression a comical mask of confusion. Elara continued, her gaze locked on Julian, refusing to let him look away. Her French was not merely conversational, it was academic, elegant, and laced with an icy precision that was far more devastating than any shout could have been. "Votre analyse de ma condition est fascinante. Cependant, permettez-moi de corriger quelques petites erreurs, non pas dans votre steak, mais dans votre grammaire. Your analysis of my condition is fascinating. However, allow me to correct a few small errors, not in your steak, but in your grammar." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like crystals of ice. The humiliation was already beginning to bloom on Julian's cheeks, a blotchy, angry red. "Quand vous avez dit « c'est le destin de ces gens », l'usage du démonstratif cesse implique une généralisation péjorative, she explained, her voice as calm as a lecturer's. When you said, "It's the fate of these people," the use of the demonstrative "these" implies a pejorative generalization. C'est une tournure un peu vulgaire. Un homme de votre stature préférerait peut-être une expression plus nuancée. It's a turn of phrase that is a bit vulgar. A man of your stature might prefer a more nuanced expression. She wasn't just replying, she was dissecting his language, stripping him of his self-proclaimed sophistication layer by painful layer. She was using her intellect, the very thing he had mocked, as a scalpel. She took a small step closer to the table, her presence suddenly commanding. Et quant à votre affirmation, que mon esprit est aussi vide que mon portefeuille, she continued, her voice dropping a fraction, taking on a harder edge. And as for your assertion that my mind is as empty as my wallet, laissez-moi vous assurer que l'un est peut-être temporairement en difficulté, mais l'autre contient des mondes dont vous ne soupçonnez même pas l'existence. Let me assure you that one may be temporarily struggling, but the other contains worlds you cannot even begin to suspect exist. The silence at the table was now absolute, a ringing void. Other nearby diners were beginning to notice, their own conversations faltering as they sensed the palpable shift in auras. Finally, Ilara's gaze flickered to the piece of meat on his plate. En ce qui concerne le steak, monsieur, she said, switching back to flawless, unaccented English, the transition so seamless it was jarring. It is cooked to a perfect medium rare, 130 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature, rested for 10 minutes. The lighting in this corner can sometimes cast a shadow that deceives the eye. She looked directly into Julian Thorne's stunned, horrified eyes. But if you still believe it to be unsatisfactory, I will, of course, have the chef prepare another. We aim to please. She finished with a smile. But it was not the hollow, professional smile from before. This one was sharp. It was brilliant. And it was terrifying. It was the smile of a queen who had just checkmated a pawn. Julian Thorne, the Titan of Wall Street, the master of the universe, sat utterly and completely speechless. He had used his language as a weapon, and she had turned it back on him with the skill of a master swordsman, leaving him disarmed, exposed, and bleeding humiliation in the middle of a crowded restaurant. The refrigerator was not just humming, it was roaring. The tableau held for a suspended moment. Ilara, poised and serene. Chloe, looking back and forth between them, as if she were watching a tennis match where one player had suddenly burst into flames. And Julian Thorne, his face a contorted mask of fury, shock, and profound, public shame. The master of the boardroom had lost control of the narrative, and he was flailing. He finally found his voice, a strangled, guttural sound. How dare you?" he sputtered in English, his French completely abandoned. "Who do you think you are?" "I'm your waitress, sir," Ilara replied, her voice still maddeningly calm. "My name is Ilara. I believe I mentioned that when you arrived." The simple factual statement was another slap in the face. He hadn't bothered to learn her name, to see her as a person, and that failure was now the cornerstone of his humiliation. "I want to see your manager. Now!" Julian roared, slamming his fist on the table. The silverware jumped, and several heads turned definitively in their direction. The bubble of elite privacy had popped. "Right away, sir," Ilara said with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She turned and walked towards the manager's station, her steps unhurried, her back ramrod straight. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the heat of his glare on her. Michael was already rushing towards the table, his face pale with anxiety. "Mr. Thorne, is there a problem here?" "A problem?" Julian laughed, a harsh, humorless bark. "This employee of yours just insulted me in front of my guest. She's insolent, unprofessional. I want her fired. I want her out of here. Now!" Chloe, finally snapping out of her stupor, chimed in, eager to realign herself with her benefactor. It's true. She was incredibly rude. Julian was just... Her voice trailed off, as she clearly had no idea what Julian had actually said. Michael looked from Julian's apoplectic face to Ilara, who had paused a respectful distance away, her expression neutral. He was a manager, not a fool. He had seen Ilara work for over a year. She was the most professional, unflappable waitress he had. He also knew men like Julian Thorne, men who treated service staff as their personal punching bags. "Ilara?" Michael asked, his tone questioning but not accusatory. Before Ilara could answer, Julian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was trying to reassert his physical dominance. "Don't talk to her. Talk to me. She's done. Pack up her things. I spend more money in this restaurant in a month than she makes in a year. You'd be wise to remember who your valuable customers are." It was a classic, brutish threat, and one that usually worked. But as Julian Thorne stood there, puffing out his chest in a desperate display of power, a strange thing was happening in Ilara's mind. The name, which had been just a label for an arrogant customer, was now clicking into place with a sickening resonance. Thorne. Julian Thorne. Her breath caught in her throat. A cold dread, far deeper and more personal than the tension of the last few minutes, washed over her. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, as she discreetly typed his name and his company into the search bar under the cover of the service station counter. The search results loaded instantly. Thorne Global Acquisitions, CEO, Julian Thorne. And there it was, an article from 3 years ago. Thorne Global completes hostile takeover of boutique tech firm, Vance Innovatech. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from her lungs. Vance Innovatech, her father's company, his life's work. The boutique tech firm he had built from the ground up, the one that had been his pride and joy before it became his ruin. This wasn't just a random, arrogant CEO. This was him. This was the man who had orchestrated the predatory buyout. The man whose lawyers had sent the letters that made her father age a decade in a month. The man whose victory had directly led to her father's fatal heart attack, to her mother's illness, to her being here, in this apron, serving him a steak. The room, the people, the low hum of conversation, it all faded away, replaced by the ghost of her father's tired, defeated face. The professional calm she had so carefully cultivated shattered into a million pieces, and what was left behind was a raw, searing, righteous anger. This was no longer about a rude comment or a corrected grammar. This was a reckoning. Julian was still berating Michael, his voice rising in volume. "If she is still on this floor in 5 minutes, I will not only never return, I will make it my personal mission to see that no one I know ever sets foot in this overpriced establishment again." Ilara pushed off from the counter. She walked back towards the table, her steps now filled with a purpose that transcended the drama of the evening. Michael saw her approaching, and his eyes widened, pleading with her to stay back, to let him handle it. She ignored him. She stopped directly in front of Julian Thorne, who fell silent, surprised by her audacity. "You want to know who I am, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice low, trembling not with fear, but with a tightly controlled rage. He stared at her, momentarily speechless again. "My name," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the sudden quiet, "is Ilara Vance." She let the name hang in the air. Thorne's expression was blank for a moment. Vance? The name meant nothing to him. It was just another name, one of 100 companies he had gutted and absorbed. "My father," Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength. was Robert Vance, the founder of Vance Innovatech. The color drained from Julian Thorne's face a second time that night, but this time it was not from shame. It was from the chilling shock of a ghost, from a forgotten ledger rising up to confront him. The unraveling had just begun. The unraveling of Julian Thorne began not with a shout, but with a terrifying, transformative stillness, as he stood there, bellowing for her termination, demanding fealty from a manager who was now little more than a terrified bystander. Ilara felt the world around her dissolve. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of distant conversations, the frantic apologies of Michael, all faded into a dull, featureless roar. In its place, a single memory, sharp and excruciatingly clear, rose to the surface of her mind. It was her father, Robert Vance, sitting at their large oak dining table, not for a meal but hunched over stacks of corporate documents. The warm, comforting lamplight of the room seemed only to illuminate the deep, new lines etched around his eyes and mouth. He wasn't speaking. He was just staring at a letter, the header of which was a brutally simple, aggressive font. Thorne Global Acquisitions. His face, normally so animated with intellectual vigor and gentle humor, was a mask of grey, exhausted defeat. He had looked up at her as she entered, and for a fleeting second, he seemed not to recognize his own daughter. In his eyes, she saw the abyss that had swallowed his company and would soon swallow him. That abyss now had a name and a face, and it was standing 10 feet away, complaining about a stake. The professional calm she had cultivated for 3 years, the emotional armor that had allowed her to survive, shattered. It didn't just crack, it vaporized. What was left behind was not the weary waitress. It was the grieving daughter. And she was filled with a righteous, incandescent rage that burned away every last trace of fear. Julian was still mid-rant, his voice a weapon of pure entitlement. If she is still on this floor in 5 minutes, I will not only never return, I will make it my personal mission to see that no one I know ever sets foot in this overpriced establishment again. Ilara pushed off from the service station counter. Her movement was so deliberate that it seemed to pull the focus of the entire room. She walked back towards the table, and with every step, she felt power flowing back into her limbs. Her stride was no longer the shuffling, efficient gait of a server, but the measured, purposeful walk of someone approaching a witness stand from which they knew they would not be dismissed. Michael saw her coming, his eyes widening in panic. "Ilara, no, please!" he hissed, trying to intercept her. "Let me handle this. Go to the back." She met his gaze, and the look in her eyes stopped him cold. It was a look of such profound, unshakable resolve that he could do nothing but step aside, becoming just another spectator to the unfolding collision. She stopped directly in front of Julian Thorne. He fell silent, taken aback by her sheer audacity to re-engage. He looked her up and down, a sneer forming on his lips, ready to unleash a fresh volley of insults, but he never got the chance. "Does the name Robert Vance mean anything to you, Mr. Thorne?" Ilara asked. Her voice was unnaturally calm, low and resonant, yet it carried across the silent room with the clarity of a ringing bell. The question was not what he expected. It was a non sequitur, a piece from a puzzle he didn't know they were solving. He frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his features. What? Who? He searched the Rolodex of his mind, filled with thousands of names of competitors, allies, and victims. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but insignificant, like a company he had acquired and liquidated years ago. A footnote. "Let me be more specific," Ilara continued, her voice gaining a steely edge. "Vance Innovatech, a boutique technology firm. You may remember it. Your firm initiated a hostile takeover 3 years ago. You dismantled it, sold it for parts." The color began to drain from Julian's face for the second time that night. This was not some random act of insolence from an employee. This was something else entirely. Something personal. He finally placed the name, not with any emotional recognition, but with the cold, detached memory of a successful transaction. It had been a particularly satisfying kill, swift and merciless. "That was a business transaction," he said, his voice turning cold and defensive. He straightened his tie, a subconscious gesture to reaffirm his authority. "A matter of public record. It has nothing to do with you." A bitter, humorless smile touched Ilara's lips. "It has everything to do with me," she said, her voice dropping, trembling not with fear, but with a tightly leashed fury. "You want to know who I am, Mr. Thorne? You've been demanding to know who I am all night." She took another step closer, invading his personal space, forcing him to meet her gaze. "My name," she declared, her voice now rising with righteous power, "is Ilara Vance. Robert Vance was my father." The declaration landed like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Chloe, who had been watching with a kind of horrified fascination, looked at Julian as if seeing him for the first time, not as a titan of industry, but as a villain in a tragedy that was unfolding in real time. Julian stared at her, his mind reeling. The daughter of that weak, sentimental fool who couldn't handle the pressures of the market. Here, working as a waitress? The sheer, absurd improbability of it was eclipsed only by the catastrophic inconvenience. This was a complication he could not bully or buy his way out of. That's ridiculous," he stammered, falling back on a weak, reflexive denial. "Is it?" Ilara countered, relentless. "Is it ridiculous that your business transaction left my family in ruins? Is it ridiculous that the stress of fighting your predatory tactics, of watching you slander his name and gut his life's work, put a hole in his heart that no surgeon could fix? He is dead, Mr. Thorne, and you are the reason." "Now see here," Julian snarled, finally finding his footing in aggression. "I will not be held responsible for the failures of a weak man. Your father couldn't compete, and he paid the price. That is the law of the market. He was a casualty of progress. You should be blaming him for leaving you in this mess, not me." It was a brutally cruel statement, designed to wound and silence her, but Ilara did not flinch. The fire in her eyes only burned brighter. "My father built a company that created things. He built it with integrity. You are a man who only knows how to destroy. You call it progress. I call it piracy." The standoff was absolute. The CEO and the waitress, locked in a battle that transcended their stations, the power dynamic of the entire restaurant had been inverted. Wealth, status, and authority had all evaporated, leaving only a raw human confrontation between a grieving daughter and the man she held responsible for her pain. It was into this supercharged silent tableau that the host, Ben, chose that exact moment to appear. He approached the table with the trepidation of a soldier entering a minefield, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He was escorting an older gentleman, a man who carried himself with an air of quiet, old-world dignity that was the complete antithesis of Julian Thorne's brash arrogance. He was in his late 60s, with kind, intelligent eyes, an impeccably tailored but understated suit, and a calm demeanor that seemed to absorb and gentle the frantic energy of the scene he was walking into. "Mr. Thorne," Ben stammered, his voice barely a squeak. "My apologies for the interruption. Your 9 o'clock appointment is here." Mr. Antoine Dubois. Julian's head whipped around as if pulled by a string. The transformation was instantaneous and grotesque. The snarling rage vanished, replaced by a desperate, panicked mask of corporate hospitality. He plastered a ghastly, strained smile on his face, a rictus of forced charm. This wasn't just any appointment. Antoine Dubois was a legend, the head of a French family office with generational wealth and an unshakable reputation for ethical investment. The multi-million-dollar partnership Julian had been courting for months, the deal that would be the crown jewel of his year, depended entirely on this man's approval. "Antoine, welcome. Perfect timing," Julian boomed, his voice a horrifying parody of bonhomie. He lunged forward, extending a hand, physically trying to block Dubois' view of Elara to steer him away from the emotional blast zone. "So glad you could make it. We were just finishing up a rather spirited discussion here." But it was too late. Antoine Dubois was not a man who missed details. His sharp, observant eyes had already taken in the scene. Julian's frantic, sweating face, the stunned, silent diners, the terrified manager, and the young waitress who was not behaving like a waitress at all, standing her ground with an expression of fierce, heartbreaking defiance. His gaze passed over Julian and settled on Elara. His polite, professional expression faltered. A flicker of confusion crossed his features, a slight narrowing of his eyes as he tried to place her familiar face. He saw past the apron and the exhaustion, and his mind traveled back years to cocktail parties, to conversations with his dear, innovative friend, Robert. And then his eyes widened in utter disbelief, the confusion melting away into a warm, incredulous smile. He ignored Julian's outstretched hand completely. He took a step forward, his entire being focused on the young woman. "Elara," he said, his voice rich with a genuine, gentle French accent that was an elegant symphony compared to Julian's earlier butchery. "Elara Vance? Mon Dieu, is that truly you?" The ghost at the feast had just been recognized, and the checkmate was about to be called. The connection was made. The circuit was complete, and a high-voltage current of history and consequence surged through the hushed dining room of Aria Ristorante. In the stunned silence, the three figures formed an immutable triangle of past, present, and a future that was being irrevocably rewritten with every passing second. Julian Thorne, the predator, Antoine Dubois, the arbiter, and Elara Vance, the ghost at the feast, now revealed as its avenging angel. "Elara?" Antoine Dubois repeated, his voice a mixture of profound shock and burgeoning warmth. His mind was clearly racing, trying to bridge the chasm between his memory of a brilliant young scholar, destined for academia, and the reality of the tired, aproned woman standing before him. "Elara Vance? Mon Dieu, is that truly you?" Elara's own mind was a whirlwind. The name Dubois had unlocked a dusty room in the back of her memory, a place she hadn't visited in years. She saw a flash of a kind, smiling face next to her father in his study, a bottle of aged Calvados between them, their laughter filling the house. He was one of the good ones, a friend, an honorable contemporary her father had admired. The dissonance of seeing him here, in this place, at this moment, was staggering. "Mr. Dubois," she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue after so long. It was a name from another life, a life before polished spoons and crushing debt. Julian Thorne, seeing the burgeoning recognition between them, scrambled to seize control of a narrative that was spiraling into a black hole. He attempted a laugh, a horrifying, strangled sound that was more of a death rattle for his composure. "Antoine, what a small world. It seems you know our waitress," he said, forcing the last word out, as if it were a piece of poison he had to swallow. He was trying to frame it as a charming coincidence, a triviality. But Antoine Dubois was not looking at him. He stepped past Julian's imposing frame as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture, his entire focus on Ilara. He reached out and gently, respectfully, took both of her hands in his. His were warm and dry, a grounding presence in her swirling confusion. "Child, I haven't seen you since your father's funeral," he said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. He searched her face, his kind eyes cataloguing the exhaustion and the deep, hidden sadness there. "I tried to reach your mother and you afterward, but the line was disconnected. The house was sold. You had simply disappeared. We were so worried." His gaze fell to her black apron, to the small stain of vinaigrette near the hem, to the notepad still clutched in her hand, and his expression clouded with a deep, paternal concern. "Your father, he spoke of you constantly, your thesis at the Sorbonne. He called you his greatest legacy, the one truly innovative thing he had ever helped create. I cannot reconcile that memory with this." The question hung in the air, a demand for an explanation that was both gentle and absolute. What happened? Julian saw his last chance to contain the disaster. "Antoine, really, this is hardly the time or place. We have important business to discuss. Let the staff handle their internal matters." He gestured vaguely, trying to dismiss Ilara, to render her invisible once more. It was a fatal miscalculation. Dubois' head snapped toward him, his eyes flashing with a sudden, cold anger. "Be silent," he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He did not raise it, but the authority in it was absolute, and Julian flinched as if struck. Dubois turned back to Ilara, his expression softening again. "Tell me, my dear. Tell me what happened." The entire restaurant was now a captive audience. The low murmur of conversation had ceased entirely. Forks were frozen halfway to mouths. The staff stood like statues. Every person in the room was leaning into this raw, unexpected drama. Ilara took a deep breath, drawing strength from the solid feel of Dubois' hands. She finally lifted her gaze from his and locked it onto Julian Thorne, who now looked like a cornered animal. This was her moment, not for a tirade of revenge, but for the simple, devastating power of the truth. "What happened, Mr. Dubois?" she began, her voice steady and clear, ringing with a clarity that belied her simple uniform. "Is that the world my father spoke of, the one filled with promise and intellectual curiosity, ended. It ended the day men like Mr. Thorne decided my father's life's work was worth more in pieces than it was whole." She saw a flicker of panic in Julian's eyes. He knew what was coming. "What happened?" she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "Is Thorne Global Acquisitions. You ask why I am here, in this apron? It is because the brutal, predatory, and entirely legal business practices of this man, Julian Thorne, cost my father his company, his health, and ultimately his life. It is because the stress of that loss made my mother ill. I am here because every dollar I earn goes to pay for the damage he left in his wake." She did not cry. Her voice did not tremble. It was the clear, concise, and damning testimony of a witness who had seen the crime firsthand. Antoine Dubois slowly let go of her hands. A profound sadness washed over his features, aging him 10 years in 10 seconds. He looked at Julian Thorne, and the sadness was replaced by a look of utter contempt, a chilling, visceral disgust that seemed to emanate from his very soul. "I see," he said softly. He then took a deliberate step back from the table, creating a physical and symbolic distance between himself and Julian. When I was approaching the table, Mr. Thorne, I arrived a moment before my introduction. I have excellent hearing. I overheard you, practicing your French. Julian's face went from pale to a ghastly, bloodless white. A rather cruel hobby, wouldn't you say? Dubois continued, his voice as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. To mock a person's circumstances, to assume their mind is as empty as their wallet. But for your chosen subject to be the daughter of a man you drove into the ground, that is not merely cruel, that is a sickness of the soul, that is a poverty of character so profound that no amount of money could ever fill it. Antoine, you don't understand the nuances of the deal, Julian sputtered, falling back on the sterile language of the boardroom. It was a leveraged buyout, perfectly legal. Vance Innovatech was underperforming. The shareholders— Do not speak to me of shareholders and nuances. Dubois' voice finally rose, a powerful wave of indignation that silenced Julian instantly. I speak of honor, of decency, of a man, my friend, Robert Vance, who built a company that created things. It employed people. It stood for something. And you, a man who creates nothing, a financial parasite who feeds on the legacies of better men, you came and you tore it down for a quarterly profit report. He pointed a trembling finger at Julian. I came here tonight to discuss a partnership. I was told you were a ruthless businessman, and I confess, I mistakenly believed that might be an asset in this modern world. But I see now I was wrong. You are not ruthless. That would imply a purpose, a strategy. You are merely a vandal, a bully who hides his sadism behind the veneer of corporate jargon and an expensive suit. Chloe, who had been watching this spectacular immolation with the wide eyes of a terrified spectator, made her move. With a quiet scrape of her chair, she stood, picked up her glittering clutch purse from the table, and without a single glance at the man she had been adoring moments earlier, she turned and walked swiftly towards the exit, her stiletto heels clicking a frantic retreat from the wreckage. It was the final, silent verdict from his own camp. Dubois watched her go, then turned his gaze back to the utterly broken man before him. It seems your assets are liquidating, Mr. Thorne. As is ours. He straightened his suit jacket, a gesture of finality. The deal is off. My family will not be doing business with Thorne Global. Not now, not ever. Furthermore, I will make it my personal business to inform our mutual associates in Paris, in Geneva, and in London of the true measure of your character. A man's reputation, Mr. Thorne, is his only true currency, and yours, I am afraid, has just been declared bankrupt. He looked at Julian one last time, with nothing but pity. I suggest you pay your bill. I imagine this will be your last meal at Aria. With that, he turned his back on Julian completely, a gesture of ultimate dismissal in his world, a social and professional execution performed with surgical precision. He faced Ilara, and the warmth returned to his eyes, chasing away the ice. He saw the tears glistening on her lashes now, tears of shock, of grief, and of a profound, overwhelming relief. Ilara, my dear girl, he said gently, this is no place for you. Your father's daughter does not belong here. He paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. My firm, as you may know, has a philanthropic and educational foundation. We fund arts programs. We provide scholarships. We work to build bridges between cultures. For 6 months, the position of Director of Linguistic and Cultural Programs has been vacant. It requires a sharp, empathetic mind, a deep understanding of language, and a heart that understands the importance of human dignity. It requires someone who knows the difference between value and price. He smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile. I have been searching for someone with your exact qualifications. Someone with a Sorbonne education and a real-world doctorate in resilience. Someone like you. The position is yours if you want it." The words washed over Ilara like a warm tide. A job. Not just a job, but a career. A return to the world she thought she had lost forever. The world of ideas, of language, of purpose. It was a lifeline thrown with such grace and precision that it took her breath away. She thought of her mother, of the endless medical bills, of the gnawing anxiety that was her constant companion. She saw a door opening out of a long, dark tunnel. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Say yes," Dubois urged, his eyes twinkling, "and say you will join me for a proper dinner tomorrow night, where we can discuss the details. And you will tell me everything about your mother. We will ensure she has the best doctors, the best care. Robert's family is my family." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She nodded, unable to speak, the simple gesture conveying a universe of acceptance and gratitude. She turned and looked at Michael, the manager, who had been watching the entire exchange, his mouth slightly agape. He met her gaze and gave a slow, respectful nod, his eyes filled with an awe that bordered on reverence. Slowly, deliberately, Ilara reached behind her back and untied the strings of her black apron. The simple piece of cloth felt impossibly heavy, laden with the weight of the past 3 years. She folded it neatly, a final act of professionalism, and laid it on the empty seat Chloe had just vacated. It was a shedding of a skin, a leaving behind of a life that was no longer hers. As she and Mr. Dubois turned to leave, she did not give Julian Thorne another glance. He was still standing by the table, a hollowed-out statue of a man, surrounded by the debris of his ruined evening and his shattered reputation. He was already a ghost to her, a footnote in a painful chapter that was, finally, blessedly, over. She walked beside Antoine Dubois through the silent watching restaurant, her head held high. The heavy, perfumed air of Aria gave way to the crisp, cool air of the New York night. Ilara took a deep breath, filling her lungs. It felt like the first true breath she had taken in years. She wasn't just escaping a terrible job or a painful memory. She was stepping back into her own story, not as a victim of circumstance, but as the hero who had, against all odds, finally found her way home. And so, a night that began with a cruel whisper ended with a life-changing roar of justice. Ilara's story is a powerful reminder that there is a vast, unseen universe inside every person we meet. The quiet ones, the overlooked, the people in the background of our lives often possess a strength and a story we can't even imagine. Julian Thorne saw a waitress. He failed to see the scholar, the survivor, the woman of incredible resilience who held his entire future in her hands without him even knowing it. This story shows us that true power isn't about the money you have or the title on your business card. It's about character, kindness, and the quiet dignity with which you treat others. A sharp mind and an honorable heart will always be more valuable than a fat wallet and a hollow soul. What did you think of Ilara's incredible comeback? Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone was completely underestimated and proved everyone wrong? Share your stories in the comments below. We'd love to read them. If this story moved you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable real-life stories. Thank you for listening.